What if a drain opened at the bottom of the ocean? Not a crack in the seafloor, not a tunnel through Earth, a perfectly circular hole 10 kilometers wide sitting at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. Anything that enters it disappears, and nothing can block it. How long would it take to empty the ocean? And what would Earth look like before it was over? The drain would begin almost 11 kilometers below the surface. At that depth, the water pressure is more than 1,000 times higher than the air pressure around us. The moment the hole appeared, water would be forced into it at enormous speed. Using a very simplified calculation, the initial flow would be somewhere around 36 cubic kilometers every second. That is enough water to fill every swimming pool on Earth many times over, disappearing every second. But there would not be one giant whirlpool visible from space. At least, not at first. The ocean is too large, and water thousands of kilometers away would not instantly know that anything had changed. The first effects would be concentrated around the western Pacific. The seafloor near the drain would be torn apart by the current. Sediment, rock, shipwrecks, and deep-sea life would all be pulled toward the opening. A powerful depression would form in the water above it. Currents would begin accelerating from every direction, and that disturbance would spread outward through the Pacific. Within hours, instruments around the world would detect sea level falling. At first, it might only be centimeters, but it would not stop. Harbors would become shallower, ships would begin running aground in places that had been safely navigated for centuries, coral reefs would be exposed to the air, coastal wetlands would dry out. Then, entire shorelines would start moving. After the ocean dropped by a few dozen meters, the shape of every continent would begin to change. Large areas of the continental shelf that are currently underwater would become land. Countries would gain thousands of square kilometers of new territory almost overnight, but it would not be useful land. The exposed seafloor would become covered in salt, unstable mud, dead marine organisms, and sediments that have never been exposed to the atmosphere. The smell alone would be difficult to imagine. Ports would be left kilometers from the water. Undersea cables would be exposed and damaged, coastal power stations would lose access to cooling water, desalination systems would stop working because the sea had moved away from them. And while the coastline was retreating, the ocean itself would be changing. Ocean currents are not just water moving around. They transport heat from warm parts of Earth toward colder regions. The ocean also stores far more heat than the atmosphere. As the water level fell, those currents would weaken, shift, and eventually break apart. Some regions could cool sharply, others could become much hotter. Rainfall patterns would move, monsoons could weaken or disappear, areas that depend on moisture from the ocean could begin drying out. This is where the situation gets much bigger than flooding in reverse. Losing the ocean would not simply reveal more land, it would begin dismantling the climate system. But then something even stranger would happen. The ocean would stop behaving like one connected body of water. The seafloor is not a smooth bowl. It contains mountain ranges, plateaus, trenches, ridges, and separate deep basins. As the sea level dropped by hundreds and then thousands of meters, underwater ridges would rise above the surface. Narrow passages between oceans would close. Shallow seas would disappear completely. The global ocean would begin breaking into separate trapped bodies of water. The Atlantic, Pacific, Indian, and Southern Oceans would no longer remain connected in the way they are today. Smaller areas would be cut off first. Then, larger basins would become isolated behind newly exposed ridges. And that creates the first major problem with the drain. Once a basin is cut off from the Mariana Trench, its water can no longer reach the hole. So the drain would not cleanly empty every ocean on Earth. It would empty the regions still connected to it while leaving other oceans stranded. You could end up with one side of the planet turning into a dry basin while another side still held an enormous inland sea. That would be the point where Earth stopped looking familiar. The Pacific would keep falling towards its deepest trenches. Islands would become mountains, entire underwater mountain chains would become new continents, the Mariana Trench would turn into a canyon deeper than anything currently visible on land. Meanwhile, the trapped seas would start dying. Rivers would continue carrying minerals and salt into them, but there would be less and less connection to the rest of the ocean. Evaporation would remove water while leaving the salt behind. Those isolated seas would become increasingly salty. Many marine organisms can survive only within a narrow range of temperature, pressure, oxygen, and salinity. Food chains would collapse as plankton, fish, reefs, and larger animals lost the conditions they need. The ocean currently produces roughly half of Earth's oxygen through microscopic photosynthetic organisms. That does not mean humans would immediately suffocate when the ocean life died. The atmosphere already contains a huge reserve of oxygen. But one of the planet's major oxygen-producing systems would be gone, along with the base of most marine food webs. The ocean also absorbs carbon dioxide. As its surface area shrank and its ecosystems collapsed, that carbon exchange would change dramatically. Then, the newly exposed seafloor would create another problem. Large quantities of methane are trapped beneath parts of the ocean floor inside ice-like structures called methane hydrates. They remain stable because of low temperatures and high pressure. Remove several kilometers of water, and that pressure disappears. Some hydrate deposits could begin breaking down, releasing methane and water into the sediments. The exact amount that would reach the atmosphere is uncertain, but rapid pressure loss would be far beyond anything these deposits experience naturally. The ground itself could begin venting gas. Parts of the exposed continental margins could collapse as buried sediments lost pressure and stability. Old seafloor slopes could fail in landslides hundreds of kilometers long. So while the ocean was disappearing, the former ocean floor might begin releasing greenhouse gases into an atmosphere that had already lost one of its main climate regulators. At the same time, the newly exposed dark rock would absorb sunlight differently from water. Dust and salt would be lifted by winds from the dry basins. Storms could carry that material across continents. Rain would still fall, but the water cycle would no longer work the same way. Most evaporation currently comes from the ocean, and most of that water eventually falls back into it. With much less open water, global rainfall would decline and become less reliable. Rivers would keep flowing toward coastlines that no longer existed. They would cut through the exposed continental shelf, forming new canyons as they chased the retreating sea downward. Cities built beside rivers would watch those rivers sink farther below them every year. Eventually, the flow into the drain would begin slowing. Not because the hole had become smaller, but because less connected water remained above it. The pressure driving the flow would fall as the Pacific became shallower. The last water connected to the drain would collect in the deepest trenches and basins. It might take far longer than the first rough calculations suggest for those final regions to disappear, and some isolated oceans could survive indefinitely because there would be no path from them to the drain. That may be the strangest outcome of all. Earth would not become a completely dry planet. It would become a planet divided between enormous salt deserts and a few trapped, dying oceans. The surviving seas would be deeper than many mountain ranges are tall. Their shorelines would sit thousands of meters below today's sea level. The air pressure at their lowest points would be slightly higher because they were so far below the old surface. Human civilization might try to move downward with the water. New settlements could be built along the retreating coast, then abandoned as the sea dropped again, then rebuilt farther down. But agriculture would be failing above them. Rain would be less reliable, fisheries would be gone, heat and cold would become harder to predict. Salt storms would move across the old ocean floor, and every year, the habitable parts of the planet would become more isolated. At the beginning, everyone would focus on the drain. They would study it, try to block it, and calculate how long the ocean had left. But eventually, the drain itself would no longer be the main problem. The real problem would be everything the ocean had been doing without us noticing. It stored heat. It moved that heat around the planet. It produced oxygen. It absorbed carbon. It carried moisture into the atmosphere. It connected ecosystems across the world. The ocean is not just water sitting on the surface of Earth. It is one of the systems that makes Earth behave like Earth. And once enough of it is gone, closing the drain would not put the world back the way it was. The currents would already be broken. The ecosystems would already be dead. The climate would already be shifting. The exposed seafloor would already be releasing dust, salt, and gas. The final survivors would not be standing beside an empty hole where the ocean used to be. They would be living near one of the last trapped seas, thousands of meters below the old coastline, looking up at mountains that used to be islands. and somewhere beyond them would be the largest desert Earth had ever seen, the bottom of the ocean.